Yo! Video games.
What up, dudes? Matt here with another Real Talk video, and one that's sure to boil the blood of more than a few fanboys. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is great. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is in every real likelihood going to be the game of the year, for me. And at the end of the day, all I want is for good games to sell well. So for those of you who waited at least a little bit into this video before rage commenting, that's my stance on the game itself. I love it, and I want it to do well. But let's talk a little bit of harsh reality here. This game isn't selling as much as it should be. Now, it's not selling like dirt either, and something you are going to hear a lot from me is that it's okay, because Sony dumped a whole lot of cash into money-adding this thing. But let's look at the situation, how we got here, and also I'm going to try to tackle the reasons one by one. About a month or so back, I made a tweet about the data coming out of Japan and UK regarding the early sales of Rebirth. The early weeks were showing that Rebirth was showing a downward trend for the series. Rebirth was selling less than Remake, but it was also selling less than 16. Now, while these were physical sales only, Japan still buys 70% of its PlayStation 5 games physically. But let's be real, with both countries, and Japan in particular, console gaming has all but up and died. America was always going to be where the real meat of the sales were, but something even here still seemed weird. Square Enix was being silent about its sales in the weeks ticking by since launch. Oddly silent. When Final Fantasy VII Remake launched on the PS4, it sold 3.5 million copies in 3 days, and Square was super happy to announce that right away. For context, it sold better in the same amount of time than Spider-Man and God of War 2018. By the end of last year, it was sitting pretty at 7 million sales. Now, I want to address one thing right away. Remake was a game that released in early April 2020, right as COVID was surging around the world and most people were stuck at home. It, like Animal Crossing, massively benefited from this worldwide crisis. It's certainly not the only reason. The game was very highly anticipated. It had previewed extremely well at the last E3 and the months leading up to its release, but it most certainly did play a factor. Let's fast forward to where we are today. Rebirth has been riding a wave of positive press since last year. I was personally part of it. It is one of the best reviewed Square Enix games in decades critically. I happen to share that sentiment as well. This is the best Square Enix game in decades. But it's more than just an improvement over what was in Remake. It's a massive leap forward in game design. Again, it's everything I wanted out of the recreation of the world of Final Fantasy VII. So why isn't it selling? Again, we don't have hard numbers, but we do have a little more insight from a very well-known industry analyst, Daniel Ahmad, who absolutely has access to and knows sales numbers not privy to the public, and according to him, it is selling about half of what Remake did in the same time frame and is looking to have a weaker tail. That last part meaning that the sales for Rebirth were extremely front-loaded and is selling less week over week compared to Remake sales in the weeks after release. The internet, being what it is, of course, turned this immediately into a poo-flinging contest, and if anything, I hope this video can at least bring a bit of a level-headed rationale into the discussion. First, let's talk about the install base. The first thing people tend to bring up is the fact that the PS5 is sitting at over 50 million consoles sold versus PS4, which had around 100 million when Remake came out. Now, I get this sounds like simple, solid math, but this is always a very dubious and shaky way to look at game sales. Let's take Twilight Princess, for example. When it came out with the Wii at launch, it ended up becoming the best-selling Zelda game until Breath of the Wild. When Skyward Sword came out, there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 million or more Wiis sold, and that resulted in only about half of the sales of Twilight Princess. Install base is oftentimes a fallacy for which to gauge interest in a product. Also, for raw numbers, 55 million PS5 sold means that there are more PlayStation 5 sold in the world than the entire lifetime sales of the Xbox One, the original Xbox, the GameCube, the N64, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, and it's within spitting distance of the lifetime sales of the NES. More people are gaming now than ever before, and for a console only at its halfway point, 55 million is a lot. If you want to keep comparing the numbers game, God of War Ragnarok sold over 5 million copies in its first week. That's up 2 million from 2018 God of War. Now, you might correctly surmise that Ragnarok was cross-gen. Totally fair. But then Spider-Man 2 sold 2.5 million in its first day and over 5 million in its first week. And that is a complete PlayStation 5 exclusive as well. If we want to get a little closer to home, Final Fantasy XVI, another PS5 exclusive, sold 3 million copies in its first week. And right now, the best case estimates for Rebirth are looking at like 2.5 million in a month. Now, I don't want to get all bogged down in Scott Steiner math here, but the numbers don't lie. Not as many people are buying and playing Rebirth compared to the last Final Fantasy game, or to Remake, or comparatively to other late release titles for the PS4 such as Spider-Man 2 and God of War Ragnarok. And remember, Remake sold more copies faster than both Spider-Man and God of War. However, it's narrow and COVID was definitely a factor there. So this begs the real question here. Why is Rebirth having such a drop-off compared not only to other late-release PlayStation exclusive titles, but also even more previous Final Fantasy games? It's better reviewed than the franchise has been in a long time. Word of mouth for those of us who have played through it has been mostly positive. So what gives? Well, we are unlikely to ever know the real truth, and reality is that it's probably a combination of everything, but let's go over some of the reasoning behind it. It's the second game in a trilogy. This is admittedly a bit nebulous, but this is the known part 2 of a trilogy of games, and for a lot of people, that might be enough to scare them away from it until the trilogy is complete. There's probably a number of people who either didn't finish Remake, forgot what happened, or never played Remake, and jumping into part 2 of 3 feels like a bad idea. The game being a secret sequel requiring knowledge of previous cross-media lore was an awful idea. Yep, I'm gonna lay this one on Kitase, Nojima, and Nomura. Mostly Nojima. Once word got out that Remake wasn't really a remake and was actually a sequel with time travel shenanigans, I think that started scaring a lot of would-be newcomers away. If you can mentally pull yourself away from the fandom for a bit here, imagine being a casual gamer or even a hardcore gamer that wasn't intimately familiar with the Final Fantasy series. You know 7 is the big favorite. You know there is a game called Remake, but then you find out you're not getting the whole story with Remake. You're only getting one part of it. And even then, if you bite, you start playing the game, characters start showing up and acting weird. You're not sure what the hell is going on. You don't really get why everyone loses their mind over this Sephiroth character. Remake doesn't really explain anything, because as you've now learned, Remake was made for people who had been following Final Fantasy VII since 1997. Nojima, and by extension Nomura and Kitase going along with his idea to incorporate every single Final Fantasy VII character from every single piece of extended media into the Remake trilogy was, frankly, fucking stupid. Even a person fairly in the know with the lore and characters found myself scratching my head at multiple points in Rebirth over long drawn-out conversations between two characters, one of which I knew nothing about and had never seen before, because it turns out he was from a series of mobile games, one of which its service had long since ended. I know fans of the game who have eagerly gobbled up every piece of Final Fantasy VII related media and spin-off. I think there might be setting a bad precedent for those who were looking forward to playing 7 for the first time, and instead of getting the best-looking version of a beloved story, they are getting a bizarre, timeline-spinning sequel that assumes you have knowledge of events and characters before jumping into the game. Maybe a lot of people are just waiting for all the titles to be released. And maybe there's disdain from the fact that Remake started on PS4 exclusive, but then it locked its DLC campaign to PS5 only. When it did come to PC, it wasn't smooth, and it was exclusive to Epic Game Stores for a year before finally showing up on Steam. Now anyone who played it on PC is stuck waiting again for Rebirth to be announced and released there. Now, I don't think the game or company is necessarily in trouble here. Again, Sony paid a boatload of money to lock this down. But there is a sort of harsh reality that is coming into play here, and that is, Final Fantasy as a brand is aging, but it is not growing. In the 8 years since the last multi-platform release of Final Fantasy XV, the series has only continued to shrink, and that's even counting the sales of Remake. All told, 15 altogether sold 10 million copies. Remake is north of 7 million copies. 16 hasn't been updated since the initial press release of about 3 million copies from its first week. My own personal take on all of this is that the franchise as a whole does not bring in the same amount of people as it once did. I don't particularly see a ton of younger people hopping into the franchise as I did 20 years ago. And I don't think it's a genre thing either. Persona and Nier have exploded in popularity. Baldur's Gate, Elder Scrolls, and Witcher once were series that maybe hit 1 million or 2 lifetime. Now they all sell in the 20 million range. Just let that sink in for a bit. I can't even find sales data for the first Elder Scrolls, but Part 2 sold 700,000 lifetime. Part 5 has sold more than 60 million copies, and it is still going. And I'm sure the knee-jerk reaction to that is, well, it's on everything. And to that I say, yes, it is. And maybe that's the ultimate point here. In the same month where a Sony-funded title like Helldivers 2 has already sold 8 million copies, more than half being on PC, perhaps it is time to drop these staggered releases. Now, I'm not saying Rebirth is ever going to start selling 60 million copies if it was suddenly released on everything, even though I'd sure like it to. But I think casting the widest net possible, at the very least day and date PC versions, would certainly help. Because in the end, it ultimately falls on people like me and other much bigger content creators to help share the joy of playing the game. I think people get thrown off by the whole trilogy aspect and fairly wonder if dropping $70 on the middle game of a series is worth it. As a Xenoblade streamer, I get asked all the time which game to start with, and it's made me realize how much Nintendo might have messed things up by stating Xenoblade 3 takes place after the endings of 1 and 2, when the game goes way out of its way to be extremely user-friendly to newcomers. Just not future redeemed. In the end, I think Rebirth is ultimately a fantastic game, well worth your time and worth playing. I think it sucks that it is locked to PS5 only for now, and I'm sure it's fine for Square with the fat check they got for it. But looking ahead, if games like 16 and Rebirth keep underperforming, it gives Sony no incentive to write checks in the future. And staggering off PC and multi-platform releases only hurts eventual sales for those ports down the road and feeds into a vicious cycle of franchise fatigue. Nojima's time-hopping Hail Mary of a sequel writing also isn't helping things much for newcomers either. In the end, I just want good games to sell, and this is a very good game. I'll keep saying it, and I do hope things pick up for the game because I do think it's worth it. All that being said, go play Xenoblade. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you on the channel. Later, dudes.